Hi, good morning. It's great to see everybody here. I do need to thank Willa for overriding Senator Risch and giving me the job that I was supposed to have. Thank you, Willa. Paige, I'm so thrilled to be here with you. We've got about 25 minutes to have a conversation, and I feel like it's a conversation we could have for hours.
Exactly.
But I think, excuse me, we're looking at a moment right now in global democracy where the decline across the globe is obvious, where we are looking at different trends and different tools that are being used by leaders, some authoritarian, some wannabe authoritarians. And I think what this does is it sets the Carter Center up to be ever more important, ever more essential in a very crowded field, right? Like there are many organizations, not just American ones, doing this all over the world. And here in the United States, we have historically done this looking out for the most part. But now, given what Senator Van Hollen talked about in the assault on our own democracy, we are also looking in. So I want to get to that. But before I do, I want to ask you a little bit about the Carter Center's work observing elections around the world and supporting these cornerstones of democratic development. Can you share with us generally what you believe makes for strong and resilient democracies? Is there a special sauce? Are there things that you're always looking for or trying to put in place as you work with communities around the world?
Thanks, Sarah. And I think that when we look at democracies around the world, we're always looking for this checks and balances, rule of law, and engaged civil society. And all of those things together tend to elevate everybody's voice. And this is what we assume democracy is about. It is not what we are showing right now. And so as we sort of pull the thread on what it is we need to see, what is that balance, we have to look at our own democracy and say we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves.
That's great. So that brings me to my next question. We talked a little bit about this last week, but you joined the Carter Center in 2020. You came from an extraordinary career overseas, working in a range of regions, Europe and the Middle East, and doing a lot of aid and democracy work as well. And you got to the Carter Center at a pretty pivotal moment for American democracy, and you realized that you needed to turn inward with the organization, that you needed to bring the Carter Center's work on democracy home to the United States. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Tell us how it went. President Carter was still alive at that point and how he responded to that?
Yeah, well, so if everyone goes back to June 2020, imagine where you were. So I had left Washington. I had been at USAID for 2 decades, and we had moved to Amsterdam. And it was this moment where we had gone for a year, stayed for 3 years. It was wonderful to be far outside the Beltway. It didn't feel far enough outside the Beltway at the time. But I got a call from a headhunter for the Carter Center. Now, Atlanta is home for me. That's native. My parents say I visited other places for 35 years before I came home. And so June 2020, I'm flying into Atlanta. It's the middle of COVID. CDC greets us and says, have you been to Iran or China recently? And I'm thinking, I'm leaving Europe. That was the day, June 1st, that was the day that Europe lifted the ban and people were able to go to restaurants. And so they had flattened the curve. And here I am entering the viral stew of Georgia. I'm like, that seems odd. My brother picks me up. We drive down Peachtree Street. Remember, this is the weekend after George Floyd was murdered. If you remember what the Atlanta press was like and what Peachtree Street looked like, the aftermath of the protests was pretty violent. So my hometown, I'm driving down, I'm seeing the aftermath of the protests. I get to my parents' house, they have the TV on, they're popping champagne, their daughter is home, finally moved back to Atlanta, and I see the President of the United States tear gassing Lafayette Square. And I burst into tears. My parents are like, yes, we're also so happy you're home. And I'm like, that's not it. I'm bringing my family back to a country that I don't recognize after 3 years of being gone. And so the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call Jason Carter, who is President Carter's oldest grandson and the chair of our board. And I said, we need to talk to your grandparents. I don't know how I run an international development organization when we're not willing to look in our own backyard. Because a week later, we had the primaries in Georgia. there were 5-hour lines in Fulton County to vote in 90-degree heat. It made no sense to me. So we go down to Plains, and President Carter, who is, of course, very frugal, I said to him, what are you saving your money for? Like, I don't have time between June and November to go to the Soros Foundation and the Koch brothers and raise money to try to prove that we are nonpartisan. Like, we can go to Liberia and 125 elections in 40 countries as the Carter Center, and everyone's like, great, the international observers are here. You go to Fulton County and you've got a blue shirt on saying Carter Center, and they're going to put you in the corner. And I said, I don't have time to raise the money, so what are you saving your money for? And he said, a rainy day. And I said, it's pouring outside. And so with his approval at 95, he said, I've never done domestic work except for mental health, and I think now's the time to do it. So we went in, and we went in fully on this. It was a time where, again, you remember 2020, and you look at where we are in 2026. You've got technological innovations sort of running rampant. You have humanitarian crises. You've got climate change. You have economic instability. You have mass migration. You have polarization, isolation. We can keep going on. This is not something our generation and the multiple generations in here have experienced. Those were other countries that happened to. And we were always addressing that in other countries. And so we needed to figure out how to bring this home, how to actually talk about the issues that we were all no longer on solid ground. And President and Mrs. Carter said, let's lean in on this. And so now 40% of our peace work is in domestic work. So the work we do in Mali and Sudan on conflict resolution and political violence, we are doing here in Georgia, Arizona, 8 different states.
So it's so great. One of the things, having worked on democracy and human rights for a long time overseas, one of the things I've always been struck by is how in America we don't necessarily learn from our friends and allies overseas and how important it is in this moment. There are similar pressures all over the world. Some of them are across borders, you mentioned mass migration, the tech issues, climate, that are impacting democratic backsliding. And some of them are distinctive to the United States. And the conversations, I think, over the last year or so, no doubt, in part because of the Carter Center, are happening more and more, right? American civil society organizations are talking to the French, they're talking to the Brazilians. Those conversations are so important. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is distinctive here in the United States that is different than what other threatened democracies are facing, or do you see no distinction?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the authoritarian playbook, we're going, step by step through that playbook. And you look at Hungary, for example, 16 years of the press being pulled down, university, education, all of that being pulled down. But what ended up happening is they talked to people. Peter Magyar went into these events and had real conversations with people. That's like retail politics that we don't necessarily do. I think Congressman Jason Crow had said earlier today, you have to run like you're running as a mayor. You have to know everything. You have to be, it's not all at the national level, it's at the subnational level. So one of the biggest differences is that American exceptionalism, like this isn't going to happen to us. This is not an issue that we expect we're going to have to deal with because our politicians are going to take care of this. Bill Clinton had this wonderful line at one point where he said, in times of sort of in disruption, people are looking for a strong leader with bad ideas as opposed to a weak leader with good ideas. And I'll tell you, working for Jimmy Carter, when he told everyone to put a sweater on and turn your heat down during the energy crisis, Americans didn't want to hear that. Because we are exceptional. We don't need to do that. We don't need a sweater. We can have heat and a sweater. And it is different in America because we have had generations of this. But Poland, you mentioned other countries, Poland, Bangladesh, South Korea, you look at what Gen Z has been able to do. And we can learn lessons from them. And so this is a point, again, where the Carter Center, protecting civil society often means taking civil society activists, lawyers in particular, into places like Poland. We've done study tours in Poland. We're going to Brazil. How do we learn from the March of 1,000 Robes? How do we figure out in Poland when these judges took to the streets and said, enough is enough? Where are we in that process, and where can Americans be? And so we have to find those bright stars and that North Star in other places to figure out how we come back to where we need to be.
It's fantastic to be doing that work, but what's the response in the communities you're working in here in the United States? Are they eager, engaged, or sort of apathetic?
Well, again, what we do in Sudan and Mali, we're doing in Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Nevada. We're all over doing it because we've taken right-leaning leads and left-leaning leads, and we've brought them together, just like we would do warlords in these countries. And so we're in Florida with left and right-leaning leads. North Carolina, they go and do town halls like this, and there'll be people with MAGA hats on, and you've got the Supreme Court Justice from North Carolina, who's a Republican, former Supreme Court Justice, and the former Democratic Mayor of Charlotte, sitting on stage like this saying, ask us anything. There are not little men in the machines changing your votes. Let us explain how this works. And that's the talking to and listening piece that I think we have difficulty doing, especially recognizing our target audience is not ourselves. Our target audience are the people that we need to convince. So I found it fascinating, again, back to retail politics, not that I'm a politician, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend, and David and Michael laughed at this, the state election board in Georgia. Like, you can stream this stuff. It is not pretty, but that's how government works at the local level. And if you were there, if you were present, you happen to be in the hallway grabbing a Coke with someone, and they say the sky is purple and you say it's blue, you can have a conversation, because it's hard to disprove a negative if you're screaming across the street from each other at protests. You have to actually engage, and that's where I think we are right now.
You're giving us some hope, dare I say, some slivers of hope. And it makes me wonder, do you think we are still in a democratic recession? Does the Hungarian election, you mentioned Bangladesh and the extraordinary people-powered protests there that changed sort of an entrenched prime minister. Do you feel that we are moving in a direction that will bring us forward from not just from back to where we were, we've been talking a lot about that, but forward to a new place that meets sort of where we are right now and pushes us to a better place?
Yeah, well, I think as Krista just talked about, we have to find that place. It's up to us to find that place. I think we are in a democratic recession. We are seeing this, but we've been here before. You have to remember, we went from slavery, segregation, McCarthyism, to mass surveillance after 9/11. We've seen it, but it didn't feel like it affected us so viscerally. My daughter got doged from State Department, and I spent 2 decades at AID, so I take this all very personally. But there's a but and an and. There are places that we can go to make this better. I'm not going to, put lipstick on a pig and say, oh, we'll be fine, the pendulum swings back. But it will swing back. But we are active participants in this. And if we're not present, if we're not voting at every election, if we are not attending town halls, if we are not supporting civil society organizations that are trying to do this, and if we're not listening to each other, it's not going to happen.
You probably have been getting a lot of questions about what the election in Hungary means for the United States. And one of the things you've just talked about, sort of doing this people-powered work at all levels of government, getting out there. And the other thing that's come up, Congressman Crow talked about it, Van Hollen talked about it, and Andrew, you talked about it also, listening. We frankly are not very good at doing that here in the United States to each other. We are not great at doing it in Washington, and taking those different views and sort of pulling them together to move forward. Which brings me to my next question, which is a question about political violence. We are really at a point where we are not listening and people are resorting to violence in ways many of us in this room have not seen, right? We have a long history, you mentioned a lot of it in the United States, of political violence, right? The Civil War, the early 1900s related to immigration, the 1920s, and McCarthyism, post 9/11, the Civil Rights Movement, the Tulsa Massacre. Like, you can go on and on about the violence, but in the last 30 to 40 years, arguably, it's been a bit calmer, at least at the national level when it comes to where we are in the United States. But that's changed pretty significantly across a number of years here. How does that impact the work you're trying to do at the Carter Center here in the United States specifically? Because it's such a different way to work in the United States than historically, I think, we've required.
Yeah, so political violence is not acceptable by either side. And we all say the same thing, that it's not acceptable. But it seems partially acceptable to one side when it's happening to the other side. So having those democracy resilience networks throughout the country, those are the people who made comments during what was happening in Minnesota, during the killings there. For me, it's not the Carter Center doing it. It's Michiganders for Resilience. It's Wisconsin's ACT. It's North Carolina for Free and Fair Elections. They have localized this. And so when they make the statements, we are supportive of the statements. But if it comes from the Carter Center, it doesn't always look like, it looks like it's from the left. And so having them make the statement, that's when you localize it. I would say you talked about the 1906 massacre. So here's a perfect example of a colleague of mine in Atlanta who actually got that language changed from a riot to a massacre. It didn't take a whole lot to get that language changed. It meant talking to people individually. It taught style editors at AP, like, what is the acceptable language to use? And we have to use that language so it hits home and we know exactly what's happening. I would lastly say it's kind of like, I think of political violence as if you were in a hospital and you need a heart bypass. Well, the thing that needs to happen is your muscles and organs need to work together. And when the heart goes on bypass, if the muscles and organs aren't working, you will die. And when the heart comes back on, everything is going to have atrophied if it wasn't working together. So we have to find a way for all of the systems to work together. So when the body goes back off heart bypass, that you are actually a fully functioning society. And that means touching on political violence, free and fair elections, stronger civil society, education, universities, legal system, all of that has to keep working. And that's kind of where we are right now. The muscles and organs have to be working to make sure that we're in a good place when the heart comes back on.
Yeah, I think that deserves some applause. For many of us in this room, we have seen the United States and the groups that do this work as sort of democracy net exporters, right? We are bringing, supporting, promoting, sustaining democracy overseas. And even when things at home have been difficult, we can use that to our advantage, right? To say we are an experiment in a sense, and America is constantly evolving, and that's what happens in open societies, and nobody's perfect, right? We don't have the absolute truth. But I wonder now if we are actually a net importer of democracy, and if not, what's the right balance for those of us that work in this space globally, who are thinking about how we engage personally or professionally, domestically? What do you see as that balance, given the moment we're in and the importance of individual commitments at multiple levels to this work?
So not being an academic, but everyone's seen all of the studies, what Steve Levitsky says, what Erica Chenoweth says, 3.5% of the people coming to the streets, will change things. So, but let me bring it back down again, kind of to the body. All of us, the first 18 years of our lives, we grew up in a household where you had siblings or you were an only child, and you figured out how to work within that construct of appeasing your parents, getting along with your brothers, in my case, 3 older brothers, so it took a lot more maybe than it took everyone else in the world, but you figure that out in the first 18 years of your life. And yet, here we are unable to talk to neighbors, unable to talk to family members who we have difference of opinions with. We have to depoliticize this. We have become so partisan at this point. And I think that that's one of the things we're learning when we look at other countries. We're a two-party system. Other countries have a list of 36 pages when they have elections. Everyone's got an opinion. And for us, it's come down to this very partisan left or right. And we need to get to a place that people are having the conversations that are not just about the partisanship, but it's about our values, it's about our core needs, it's about our children and what they need, it's about our parents and what they need. And so our net exporting has always been, people still think America in our 250-year experience and attempt at democracy is one they can learn from. And so we have to prove to them that there are ways that we can address changes. Democracy, the biggest bug in democracy is that we can vote in different leaders. When you vote in an authoritarian and a tyranny, it's permanent. It's never permanent. Nothing is permanent in this country. And so I don't think 16 years of what we saw in Hungary is something that we have to worry about. The question is, what are we going to do, and how are we going to show the rest of the world? Because we're kind of an unreliable partner now. We're very much an unreliable partner overseas, but we need to prove that we can come back from that.
That's the work that we have to do, which I keep saying, we aren't in a hopey-changey mode anymore. We are like a roll up your sleeves and get to work. And one of the things that I have really seen, for those of you who live here in DC over the last year, you've seen communities come together, right? Whether it's responding to ICE and security of our communities, families in schools. This local engagement has been so valuable because it reminds us that we can make change starting at the local level. We can be part of something bigger than ourselves. Again, to Andrew's point on service, right? We do want to be part of something, and we want to be part of pushing for the good. But when you have an administration, and in this case a Congress, that is so defiant on the basic fundamentals of constituent engagement and the rule of law, and assaulting so many of those fundamentals that the Carter Center promotes, it's hard to feel like you can make a difference. I think some of the things you've talked about today have really reminded us that there are networks that can help do that and pull that in. So instead of asking you what gives you hope, I'm going to ask what keeps you in the game. This is a big issue that Carter Center works on, and it is kind of the issue of the times.
Yeah, well, keeping in mind, I'm pretty far outside the Beltway now. Down in Atlanta, Georgia, the center of the political universe, we like to say. I can't remember how many times I voted in 2020 with all the elections we ended up having, and now by ballot, sitting with somebody else in Fulton County. But it's subnational. We worry, and you all worry a lot about what's happening in Congress. I worry more about what's happening at the local level. We've got 159 counties in Georgia. Texas is the only state that has more counties. It's 159 different elections. It's 159 counties that have policies that can affect change at everybody's level. So whereas we look at the national level, at the Carter Center, we're doing a lot more at the subnational level. We run a program called Inform Women, Transform Lives, for example. And that is running campaigns that mayors have in 48 different cities across 5 continents. They have processes to help the local community, whether it's domestic violence, collecting trash. They have that in their budget, yet no one knows about it. The vulnerable populations don't know about it. So if you're in Nairobi, Kenya, and you have a domestic violence issue, you don't know that there's a hotline you can call until we came in and ran a campaign and put the hotline up in one of the food markets, and then suddenly by 400% the number of calls changed. People realized this is actually local. I don't have to go into a national place to say I'm having a problem. So we did it in Atlanta, Georgia. People aren't going to walk into police stations if they're being abused and say, I need help. But there are 36 different fire stations throughout the city of Atlanta those fire stations, every kid knows a fire station is safe, a fireman's safe. I mean, the firemen go to our kids' schools just to show them that they are safe and not to be afraid of. And then we made a supposition that it was all going to be in South Georgia, South Atlanta, that these problems were happening. It was in the ritzy-tony areas of North Atlanta. And so we learned a lesson in our own backyard that what we saw and what we thought is actually not what's happening. So I would say what gives me hope is local level, local politics, community organizing, community development, because it's going to be one person at a time. You know, John Lewis, going back to some of the civil rights issues, Martin Luther King talked about a beloved community. Treat each other as you want to be treated, because we will reverse places. And John Lewis said, every democracy, every generation has to learn what democracy is. And it's our generation's goal to figure out now how to take that forward. And so that's what gives me hope, is that we had 2 previous leaders just in the state of Georgia who told us, it's not about us, it's not about you, it's about the larger whole and how you participate in it. So that's what gives me hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Paige.